From a dystopian world, the concept of cyberspace and a bleak outlook on the future embodying a noirish, gritty, Asiatic background in a city filled with neon lights, kanji, graffiti, and garbage. This genre perfectly represents the anxiety of the moment. Cyberpunk is a very niche genre of first literature, then cinema films that came about in the 1970s and fully bloomed in the 1980s. Cyberpunk perfectly embodies the anxieties of the 80s and 90s, traced in neon and slapped on billboards, which, more than any other genre of its time, demonstrates in dramatization our incapacity to imagine the future. From Blade Runner forward, the mere sight of kanji on the walls of an American building aroused fear in some deep corner of the viewer's heart and soul. Homogeny was not here to stay. We are cave dwellers in a post-war society, absorbed into the dream of sci-fi, a vision best shown through the cyberpunk genre. Cyberpunk in question is perhaps better understood these days as more of a style rather than a particular genre, story type, or even setting, because so much is depending on the visual icons that became associated with cyberpunk through films, literature, and gaming. To many, what comes to mind when they hear the term cyberpunk doesn't extend beyond androids and computer hackers. However, cyberpunk has a very rich history and spanned many memorable works. You've definitely dabbled into the realm of cyberpunk genre through films like Blade Runner, Ghost in the Shell, and Akira. While many argue that William Gibson's Neuromancy novel laid the groundwork as we know it for this nitty-gritty genre, the reality is, the Japanese cyberpunk origins are far from our current-day interpretation of the genre, and are rooted in the societal changes and anxieties brought about by technology and a booming economy. From the 80s home VHS player, television, camera, and game consoles, it meant one important thing, that Japan became inextricably linked and associated to technology. Scholars and academics have thrown the term Techno-orientalism, which throws the stereotypes that technology is always Asian to some degree, and inextricably linked with what entertainment technology is being consumed overseas outside of Japan's borders, which is a stereotype that still holds today. Perhaps what sparks a passion and sense of nostalgia about Japan is that we unconsciously consume products of Japan, which become a foundation for our happiness and memories during our childhoods. From the old Nintendo consoles and films on TV like Ponyo, or if you're born in 2001 like me, you may have grown up watching Studio Ghibli's Spirited Away. As a child, you aren't aware or subconsciously thinking that these are products of Japan, and Japan's mentality in media. You're just enjoying and indulging in the entertainment. But it's without a doubt that some nuisances, like images, for example, Chihiro's clothing, or some architecture in Spirited Away, or even the mannerisms and music portrayed in Nintendo characters. These are more representative of the Japanese psyche than we are led to believe on the surface. As we grow older, we question all the things we consumed as kids and realize that the source of our happy childhoods were products of Japan. Naturally, we become curious, and this segues into the neo-Tokyo-centered, pseudo-Asian world and techno-orientalism that spans all aspects of the cyberpunk cinema. The world in the 80s was looking at Japan to lead into the postmodern world. However, Western cyberpunk films failed to touch on the pressure and mental condition of society at the time it was created. But rather, Western films focused on what defines us as humans, biology or emotions. Can a machine be considered human? You can see this in the famously acclaimed Star Wars. George Lucas, the creator, was heavily inspired by Akira Kurosawa films, and the concept of being more machine than man was a big topic with the villain Darth Vader. The industry stresses in Japan, making the outlook on the future very distressing, and sudden cultural changes that were dominating their way of life. The economy was booming, and cities were doubling in size. Life was changing fast. Japanese filmmakers were the only people who could really explain this because they were actually experiencing it and had a medium to embody the psyche of the time. Western films show a view of distance and reflection. They are meditative, whereas Japanese cyberpunk films are incredibly fast and brutal and totally kinetic. There is an urgency and intensity to them. There was no thinking, just reacting. Films like Tetsuo, the Iron Man, Crazy Thunder Road, and Death Powder embodied these perfectly. Cyberpunk films of Japan, made by independent artists who were directly influenced by the drastic changes in Japan. They created films that were more punk than cyber, with rough and ready aesthetics, straight from the belly of the beast, and weren't defined by Techno-orientalism, straight from the source, which is Japan. This is the true origin of the cyberpunk genre. There are two important categories, post-human and transhuman. Post-human films like Ridley Scott's 1982 Blade Runner or Ghost in the Shell, worlds that are defined by the next stage of humanity, where films were dominated by implants and mechanical modifications as well as virtual reality. This is post-humanism. The transhuman narrative, on the other hand, focuses on the tradition on becoming this idea of post-human. This is where we find most of the Japanese cyberpunk films, at least the live-action ones, because most of the anime films like Ghost in the Shell had a large Western-backed budget to achieve the modern future of a post-human world. Mostly the independent film narratives gave birth to the Neo-Tokyo narratives and the development on the next stage of humanity. But these films never showed it in a favorable light at all. Instead, the tradition is often painful, harsh, and shocking. A pure reflection of Japan's cultural shift during the 80s. Ishii, Tsukamoto, and Fukui are just three of the most prominent pioneers of cyberpunk cinema at its roots in Japan. All these three filmmakers are connected from similar areas, subcultures, and similar messages. Gakuryu Ishii, formerly known as Sogo Ishii, was a young filmmaker who made his first feature-length film before he even finished school. He was arguably the poster boy of punk filmmaking and planted the seed for future cinema. Panic at High School was one of his first feature films. It was crude and charged with energy. It was thematically radical. The film is about a student that turns violent and murders one of his teachers. It is a clear reflection of the angst against the strict education system they found themselves in. There was also Yukihiro Sawada's film Crazy Thunder Road, about a biker gang, similar to those themes from Akira. It's a Mad Max-like tale of anarchy and lacks the elements of cyber but makes up for it with punk, making it so close to the films that would come. Gakuryu Ishii and Shinya Tsukamoto, who went on to create the film Tetsuo the Iron Man, the very connection between these two pioneers shows a symbolic movement and a symbiotic movement that didn't embody the director's feeling, but rather the larger cultural feeling in Japan. Ishii's later Burst City film was an embodiment of wanting to create a film and depict the very cultural feeling beyond the artistry of punk. He truly captured the essence of what punk was. Burst City was a raw, angsty, and kinetic film. Shigeru Izumiya worked on at the set of Burst City and shared many of Ishii's cultural feelings. Izumiya went on to create Death Powder, upon the punk sense that Ishii actually pioneered, and this became the template finesse formula for future cyberpunk films. In 1989, we see the culmination into everything that was a film of cinematic achievement and masterpiece of cyberpunk filmmaking. Tetsuo the Iron Man. Tetsuo as a film is all about change. No surprise it's about change, as earlier I mentioned the changes in the metropolis that is Tokyo and the Japanese psyche in a rapidly evolving economy. As a result, it makes this film in particular, that is defined by change, change that is brought on by metal and chrome, two defining materials of technology. In the film, when the fetishist is run over by the salaryman, their bodies actually become interlinked and become one with metal. The salaryman's transition is not a beautiful one. It's a very painful one. He groans and agonizes as his body warps and distorts until little of him actually remains. When the fetishist and the salaryman confront one another, they combine to become one huge humanoid monster, a monster that resembles little flesh and little human aspects. Two men are drowning in metal and chrome, and this is a representation, the consumeristic culture that now embodies Japanese society. Maybe also, it's a reflection of the lost tradition of Japanese heritage and the dominance of the new technological culture. It's clearly a narrative about change, and most importantly, Tsukamoto doesn't seem to be depicting that change in a favorable way. Tsukamoto anticipates a huge cultural change and shows anxiety towards it. Fukui, who worked as a crew member on the set of Tetsuo, known for his experimental short films, his works would go on to represent the genre into the 90s, such as 964, Pinocchio. The 90s is when the economy started to show signs of being unstable. The once booming industry of Japan was beginning to show signs of beginning to crack, and Fukui shows this in 964 Pinocchio. Unlike this film's peers, it focuses on transhuman and post-human themes. The film depicts a malfunctioning sex android that gets tossed away. This film is focused on the problematic issue of the consumer culture. What happens to all this technology when it's no longer needed? The android part of the technological age is thrown away on the streets, worried about all this tech and where it's gonna go. The android represents the transhuman experience, and this story is filled with pure aggression, radical and powerful emotions. Fukui then goes on to create Rubber's Lover, a traditional transhuman narrative that captures individuals to experiment on them. This film is forming the ultimate example of the genre. Every trick the genre uses and has been using is ramped up to 100 in this film. It's not tiring. It's cathartic in nature. It shows the potential that experimental films can reach. Fukui established himself as an equal to Tsukamoto and Ishii. They are all linked, they all shared and knew each other, and they all felt the cultural shifts. Ishii somewhat started the genre as we know it today. In 2001, he created Electric Dragon 80,000V. The cyberpunk aesthetic has finally arrived, but without jeopardizing the punk-like roots of Burst City and Crazy Thunder Road. Electric Dragon actually helms the genre he created. It's climactic. You're finally seeing the film he should have made so long ago. It's a perfect resolution. It finally gives closure to the narrative circle of these Japanese directors. Now Cyberpunk is having a bit of a resurgence. Alita Battle Angel, Ready Player One, and Cyberpunk 2077 share the themes and aesthetics of early cyberpunk films, but the original Japanese works of cinema are unique and authentic to this day. They have failed to be emulated in any way, shape, or form, and Japan's cyberpunk films still stand alone. They still have much to show, and so much to tell us about the mental state of humans in our fast-paced modern world. Thank you for watching. I hope that you learned something about the origins of Japanese cyberpunk.